Kiro and Obo. Kiro lived with his mother and his two twin brothers Seppo and Musa. Next door lived Mrs. Malusi. Mrs. Malusi had a sad yellow dog called Obo chained outside her house. Obo's water bowl was often dry and the dog was very thirsty, especially on hot sunny days. Kiro's mother worked far away from home, so Kiro and his brother were often alone. Kiro liked Obo a lot, and he talked to him when he was lonely, and sometimes he gave him a piece of his school lunch. Obo was very thin and often very hungry because Mrs. Malusi didn't feed him well. Only on Mondays Mrs. Malusi would throw a piece of meat on the ground for Obo to eat. One day, when Kiro came home from school, he saw something horrible. A bad girl was throwing stones at Obo. Obo was jumping and barking, and he howled when a stone hit his head. Kiro was so angry that he ran at the girl and pushed her. All the people in the street laughed because the girl looked so silly when she landed in the mud. "Leave the dog alone," said Kiro. The girl walked away, but she turned around and threatened Kiro. "I'm going to make trouble for you," she said. Kiro was very frightened, but he didn't show it. He took the twins home because they were crying and the mother was waiting home for them. "Watch out for that girl. She does nasty things," said his mother. That night there was a terrible storm. Kiro was lying in bed, safe and warm between his brothers. He heard the thunder outside, and the lightning made the house look blue and strange. Then came the rain, like hands drumming on the roof. "I feel so lucky to be warm and safe," thought Kiro. Then he heard Obo barking outside in the rain. The dog was frightened and cold. Kiro didn't feel happy anymore. How could he help Obo? Next morning it was still raining. The twins wanted to jump in the puddles and Kiro had to drag them past Mrs. Malusi's house. Mrs. Malusi was out in the yard and she was hitting Obo with a stick. "Bad dog," she shouted. "You were barking all night." Kiro became very angry. He was afraid of Mrs. Malusi, but he couldn't bear to see Obo being beaten. "Stop!" he screamed. Mrs. Malusi put down the stick and turned to him. "If you like this dog so much, you can have him. I don't want him anymore," she said. She pulled the chain out of the ground and pushed Obo towards Kiro. Obo looked at Kiro with his brown eyes and he wagged his tail. He looked as he was smiling. Kiro smiled back and stroked him. Kiro's mother wasn't very happy about this. "He is a big dog and will eat a lot of food. And where will he sleep?" she said. "And look at him, he's wet and he's jumping up and down." "But I can work extra in the shop for Mr. Lovane on Saturdays to help pay for the food," said Kiro. "And he can sleep next to my bed on the old green blanket, please," he said. His mother smiled. "Well, I don't like how he was treated either," she said. "Okay, you can keep him, but it's your responsibility." Kiro was so happy that he danced all the way to school. And when he came home his mother had made supper and she had fed Obo. Obo stood in the doorway, and when he saw Kiro he ran up to him and gave him some doggy kisses on his hands. "I have to work late this evening," said Kiro's mother. "You have to look after your brothers. Stay in the house and be safe when it gets dark, and don't unlock the door until you hear my voice." Kiro promised to do as his mother said. Kiro fed his brothers and he washed them and he did his homework, and Obo sat next to him all the time, and sometimes Kiro stroked his ears. "Ah, you are going to be a beautiful dog," said Kiro to Obo. Obo's tail wagged and wagged. When it was getting dark, he locked the door and he put the twins to bed. He wasn't afraid because his mother worked late quite often, so he was used to taking care of everything. Later he climbed into his bed next to his sleeping brothers, and Obo curled up beside them on the green blanket. Suddenly, the door was kicked open, the lock was broken, and there stood the bad girl that had threatened Kiro. He was frozen with fear. "I'm going to teach you a lesson," the girl said. Kiro opened his mouth to scream, but before the girl could walk through the door, Obo jumped at her with a growl like a lion. The girl tried to run, but Obo tore her skirt and bit her in the leg with his big white teeth. The girl screamed, and Kiro could hear her scream all the way down the street, and Obo continued snapping at her heels. The scream then became fainter and fainter. Later Obo came back with his tail wagging and with a smile on his face. The twins, they had slept through all the noise. Kiro now pushed a chair against the door. He knelt down and he put his arms around Obo and hugged him. "Thank you, Obo," he whispered. "Now we can keep each other safe all the time." Obo covered him with dog kisses and he lay down on his blanket. Now he had found love and a warm home.